dollar, 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 that's what I need. Hey, hey. Well, I need a dollar, 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 that's what I need. Hey, hey. Said I need a dollar, 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 that's what I need. And if I share with you my story, would you share your dollar with me? Bad times are coming, and I reap what I done.
Why do you think so?
I think it's like martial law. They're just trying to condition us.
Yeah.
Thank you.
PeopleCages from San Francisco to St. Petersburg. Yeah, you just heard Maria tell how she felt about this so-called safe sleeping village that was just constructed in the Civic Center of occupied Yelamu, San Francisco this week for supposed socially distant sleeping of us houseless people. That's, of course, while thousands of hotel and motel rooms still sit empty, hoarded by a mayor who will not listen to her own board of supervisors, doctors, professionals, and definitely not us houseless folks, and open those rooms. Yeah. Since 1996, when me and Ma were sleeping on the street, we've been doing radical redistribution. We call it interdependence. It's all we got. What else you going to do to keep each other alive? And we're poverty scholars. Our knowledge comes from survival, and we can't survive without each other. This is something we call interdependence, which resists the cult of independence. Since COVID-19 began, the need of folks on the street has increased. More people are hungry, more people are scared, and so the acts of sharing have increased with all of us. That's all we're going to do. The Roofless Radio crew, that's myself and Israel and Tiburcio and others, is supporting up to 700 people a week on both sides of the occupied Ohlone Lashan Bay with homemade food, donated food, groceries, masks, cleaning supplies, hand sanitizers, poor people-led media, and more. But the reason we started Poor Magazine is because me and Ma realized the inherent violence of the settler colonial system that criminalizes poverty and poor people like us. And one of the only ways we can fight back is with our collective voices, joined together, poor people-led education, art, and solutions. In addition to media and art, we also do something we call research. That's poor people-led research, not AKKdemia or corporate surveys, studies, or tests. It's like martial law, trying to condition us. Yeah. Maria told us yesterday on the streets of occupied Yelamu when we were supporting our folks with Roofless Radio and this research, how she felt about that cage. I don't trust any fences. I've been in jail too long. I can't go back. I just wonder where the hotel rooms they were promising are, said Marcus, another Roofless Radio reporter from the TL who was living in an alley 3 blocks away from the so-called safe sleeping village, a.k.a. the cage. I just hope they don't use this as another excuse to take our tents, which San Francisco's been doing even with the pandemic, Marcus concluded. Yeah, today's podcast for a poverty scholar is dedicated to all us poverty scholars who've been criminalized and whose bodies have been incarcerated for the sole act of living without a roof. Now, you may think, oh, there's Tiny talking again. This is a sanctuary land. Well, guess what? It's a cage, and you can call it whatever you like. Let me take you back a little bit in Poor Magazine research history. Have you heard of cages for immigrant children? Well, they have them here for homeless people. Yeah, that was Pastor G.W., a formerly houseless poverty scholar and pastor from Mission Day congregation in occupied Seminole territory known as St. Petersburg. When the sanctuary, safe sleeping village showed up in Frisco last week, right after we did an action on Monday about the hoarding of hotel rooms, Many of us Power Magazine poverty scholars, including Auntie Frances Moore, D. Allen, Leroy Moore, Mutiado, Israel, Pearl Ubungian, Tiburcio, and myself and others were brought back to our own experiences of jailing, criminalizing, and or profiling for the sole act of being a houseless person, being a person of color, or being a person in poverty, or someone from the other side of the false borders. But it got really clear for some of us who had been blessed to make a terrifying journey to occupied Seminole territory to release the Poverty Scholarship book. Shout out to Leroy and Auntie Frances and D. Allen, who witnessed with our own eyes the PeopleCages. Yeah, actual cages of chain link fencing, just like what surrounds the so-called safe sleeping village. But this cage was on the streets of downtown St. Petersburg. Yeah, this cage, people had to check in by 7 p.m. They couldn't leave till 7 a.m., at which point they were kicked to the curb. Now, lest you believe the public relations campaign by the San Francisco mayor that this is sanctuary land, let me school you. Because the ones who spearheaded and supported the St. Petersburg cage were also the helping organizations, the Charity Industrial Complex, the Savior Industrial Complex, the non-profiteers, the city government politricksters, and so many so-called advocates, not to mention the police, sheriffs, and politricksters. We used to have tent cities right down this street here in St. Petersburg. Me and GW were the street sheriffs, making sure all us houseless folks were safe at night, said Bruce Wright, formerly houseless poverty scholar with the Poor People's Economic Human Rights Campaign and pastor of the Refuge Ministries of Tampa Bay, pointing at a long, empty, dark street right next to the PeopleCages. I can't even speak. Auntie Frances, who like me and Dee and others were on that tour, looking at that people cage, and who ourselves have dealt with this same criminalizing right here in occupied Wu Chin. She concluded with, this is too much, and what they want to do with all of us. So, is it a cage, or is it a sanctuary? Well, let me just drop some knowledge on you, conscious listeners, and thank you, by the way, for even hearing me. Many of us poverty scholars are already clear that most of the services or anti-social work that's provided to poor folks, and why I renamed it anti-social work, is rooted in the violent scarcity models that I have taught on in this podcast series many times. So I'm sure you already know what I have to say on that. But the reality is the scarcity models dictate how little we can break off to provide poor peoples just so they don't end up starving, versus maybe coming at it with a different perspective, which used to be in Western Europe and Canada, about how much is needed by a person or a family to survive. As well, we have to deal with criminalizing of our lives and actions and homes, with constant inspections tied to the crumbs, psych evaluations, applications, and assessments. Yeah, calling out my brother Leroy, who literally has to go in and prove his disability, according to some of the recent proposals to tighten up SSI and other insane criminalizing moves like that. And of course, let's not forget the slippery slopes of shelter beds and SROs that require constant check-ins, check-outs, ID showings, and more. So really, the 9-foot fence around a parking lot that's now called a safe sleeping sanctuary, sadly, family, isn't that different from any of the soft cages built for poor folks, including the ultimate cage that's now the biggest public housing project for 89 and 90% of disabled, very low income, and or black and brown peoples, indigenous Moana Nui peoples in this occupied land. Yeah, I'm talking about prisons and jails. I'm talking about cages Shout out to my brother Joey Villarreal, Free Atlan. Shout out to my brother Minister King Williams and the Prison Focus Project. Nor is it any different from the hater solution to COVID-19. All across this occupied Turtle Island, beginning with Las Vegas, which threw its houseless folks out of the meager one shelter that town even had, and had them sleeping in a parking lot so they could be socially distant. Or the recent move of cleaning, notice the hygienic metaphor, of houseless people out of the New York Times subway, only to have them cramped together in the lobbies of absolutely overpacked homeless shelters dangerously close to each other. Or going even further back, because like I always say, the virus of poverty has been going on a lot longer than the virus called COVID-19. To the violent removal of houseless disabled people from the old Transbay Terminal in 2010 that this poverty scholar witnessed. So the shiny new tech colonizers building known as Salesforce could be built to house more 20-something tech commuters. Something Poor Magazine shed light on our Stolen Land Hoarded Resources tour through tech earlier this year. Yeah, to get clear about where this all comes from and why people need to resist it by any means necessary, we got to go back. We got to go a little further back to the bloody settler colonial history of when the savior and the charity industries became unsafe and caring became cages. Yeah, we got to go back to the roots, a.k.a. the poor people his story, or anti-poor people bloody her story, to a terrifying thing called the ugly laws that Leroy Moore and myself have written and reported on multiple times, and a beautiful book by Sister Shiro Susan Schweik of the same name. Ugly laws in the United States arose in the late 19th century. During this period, urban spaces underwent an influx of new residents, which placed a strain on the existing communities. As a reaction to the influx of people who were impoverished, ministers, charitable organizers, city planners, and city officials across the United States worked to create ugly laws for their communities. Yeah, people charged under the ugly law were either charged a fine or held in jail until, wait for it, they could be sent to the poorhouse, the work farm, or even better, the almshouses. So let's not get it twisted, family. The first anti-social workers and shelters were known as almshouses and settlement houses, and in a terrifying twist of the charity industrial complex, they launched their own ugly laws, criminalization, so that they could also get their clients, residents, and their mere purpose for even being there. So basically, the anti-social workers would tell the police, arrest those poor disabled folk and bring them to my shelter. And guess what? Suddenly, the shelters were filled. And cages and criminalization and policing isn't new. It's just a continuation of a long process to make money off of poor people's bodies and problems that the people who are supposedly here to save us, help us, house us. In the end, it's why us poor and houseless folk at Poor Magazine, Poor People's Army, Poor People Economic Human Rights Campaign, Reclaim SF, First They Came for the Homeless, Where Did We Go, Berkeley, and Moms for Housing, have been vehemently launching our own solutions to our own problems. It's why us poor folks at Poor Magazine work so hard every day, along with our solidarity family of conscious wealth hoarders, to actually unsell Mama Earth and homefulness the world. In the end, all we ask is release those thousands of hotel rooms so houseless folks have somewhere to sleep. That's a crime in and of itself. But guess what? If the politrickster in charge, Mayor Breed, wants to continue hoarding the hotels, then just stop sweeping our unhoused bodies. Why put a 9-foot chain-link fence with barriers up around a parking lot? We don't need more people cages. And us poor folks know change won't come from a savior, pimp, or an institution. Change will only come from a poor people-led revolution. Tune in to From Katrina to Corona tomorrow night at 6 p.m. Pacific Standard Time to hear Pastor Bruce Wright, Pastor G.W., myself, Leroy Moore, and others talk about the people cages from St. Petersburg to San Francisco.
And I'm looking for somebody come and help me carry this load. I need $1, $1, $1, that's what I need. Hey, hey, well I need